from the East River into a kind of a little border between Brooklyn and Queens. And it's one of the most polluted waterways in America because of over 100 years of industrial stuff going on there. Tanneries, refineries, just all kinds of horrible stuff in terms of the environment when it's not done properly. And but it wasn't always that way. It used to be, a rich place where you can get, oysters and all kinds of herbs growing there, and it was a very fertile area. And it also was very marshy. Like in nature, if you look at like the Newtown Creek today, it's like sharp lines, like very defined. And in nature, it's never that way. You have flood areas and marsh areas, and kind of broad expanses. You've seen all those marsh kind of areas, and those are great systems for actually filtrating the water and all that. So when it used to be broad and expansive up to what's today Elmhurst, Queens, there was like a marsh area that led up to that area, and Elmhurst was called Newtown. Like how many of you have heard of Newtown High School? Anyone? Okay, so there's the Newtown High School there. There's Newtown Presbyterian Church. There's all kinds of things with the word Newtown. So that was the town of Newtown, and then this apple tree, the Newtown pippin, grew there, and it was just a little apple tree that grew on a farm, and the apples were so good that everyone fell in love with it. And Thomas Jefferson, George Washington said this was their favorite apple, and they grew them on their own estates down in Virginia. And the way they do that is they cut off a branch and they attach it to the roots of another apple tree, and then they can grow that as a new apple tree. So that's how down in Virginia they were growing this apple tree that first grew in New York. They just cut off a branch and attach it, you bind it up, and then it heals together, and now you've got one apple tree that out of two parts. So we're going to have the Newtown pippin here, and that apple tree is a historic apple. It's the New York City's only real historic apple, and it's a gourmet variety. And I've got a bag full of them so you'll be able to try them. They're really amazing apples. Then also, you guys are part of history because, does everyone here know where human beings come from? Where did we start? And, not to step on anyone else's belief, but in the scientific understanding of our origins, where do we come from? Well, I mean, like, it's geographically.
Oh, I don't know.
Anyone, any idea of what continent we come from?
Africa.
Yep, our ancestors, no matter what your ethnic group is, we came from Africa. So apples, no matter what variety that we're eating today in the store, come from Kazakhstan in Central Asia. Yep, so we have all the apples you try in the store, every variety, the ancestors go back to Kazakhstan. So that's, and basically our two species met. When people left Africa and wandered over this huge Eurasian continent, they came across the forest of apple trees. And these weren't like crab apples like you see in the wild in North America. Big juicy apples, because the bears and the deers were eating the favorite apples. And the way fruit exists in nature for one reason. It's because nature wants birds and deer and bears and all that stuff to eat it. And then, because if the animal eats it and then walks away, when they poop eventually, that seed comes out the other end in that fertile thing, because, people use, for fertilizer, they use poop for fertilizer. So it comes out the other end, and now that seed will grow there. So that's how the plant spreads itself. It has the fruit eaten, and then the seed grows somewhere else when the animal poops it out. So, the way the trees get that bear or that deer to do that is taking sunlight and turning it into sugar. So the fruit, if it's big and juicy and delicious, encourages that bear or that deer or whatever to eat it. So, as a result, the apple trees that were the sweetest and the juiciest and all that stuff were eaten more often by the bears and the deers and all that, which meant that their seeds got more attention, or more of a chance to grow. So over time, the forest got more and more fruity and sweet and all that great stuff. So now, today, we are going to have 12 apple trees that were grafted from Kazakhstan. So the origin of apples. So we have the historic New York City apple, and then also apples from Kazakhstan, or apple grafts from Kazakhstan, because this forest in Kazakhstan, nobody has to spray it, nobody has to prune it. We just like cut back the branches and kind of balance out the tree. All that stuff happens. All the fruit grows without that kind of care.
So is the forest
Yeah, okay, I'll tell you that one moment. Yeah. So, so the U.S. government wanted to find a way for our apples to take less spraying and less care, so the farmers don't have to spend much money, and also it's better for the environment, better for our health if we're not spraying the apple trees all the time, because we spray them to protect them from insects and things like that. So that's why they're here. So Cornell University and the U.S. Department of Agriculture were doing research on these trees. So they went to Kazakhstan and they took cuttings, they took seeds and all that, and they have, it was called a germoplasm. A germoplasm laboratory, which is basically just a fancy word for saying a genetic orchard. So they have a big orchard there with all these trees from Kazakhstan and other parts of Central Asia. So the question is the forest still there? Yes. Unfortunately, so much of it was lost, and the apple trees that you have here are actually an endangered species. So, like, we think about endangered species like polar bears and, or some kinds of like Siberian tigers and all that. We think about these as endangered. The black rhino. These kind of things are endangered species, but they're also endangered species of trees and plants and all that. So, this is actually an endangered species. So, you're helping, preserve this legacy for everyone in the world. So the trees, unfortunately, there's only about 20% of the forest left. So 80% of it was wiped out. And unfortunately, a lot of that was very recent. Maybe not recent in your lifetime, but say the last 20 years, which is, considering the forest is 4.5 million years old, 20 years is nothing. But when Kazakhstan opened up to the world trade and things like that, after being kind of a closed communist country for so long, when they privatized things, unfortunately, they cut down a lot of trees for shopping malls. So, anyway, yeah, the shopping malls and stupid things like that took down the forest, unfortunately. So, but it's still a big forest, and they learned their lesson. They're trying to replant it, but. So if you go to this forest, though, it's a magical thing because it's a whole forest of fruit trees. They've got apricot as well and walnut trees and things like that, but a lot of apple trees. And every single apple tree in the forest is different because apple trees reproduce by having bees go from flower to flower between the trees, and they mix up their DNA. Just like you are a combination of your parents, and so you're not exactly like one or the other. So the trees are too. So this whole forest, every single tree is different. And so if you go to an orchard in America, they have a whole bunch of Granny Smith and a whole bunch of Red Delicious, whatever. This is a whole forest of diversity. And you're going to help preserve that diversity and introduce some new, because these guys are going to mix up with each other, and they're going to also mix up with the new Tom Pippin. So that's what we're here to do today.
And in the forest, like the ones that are growing here are a shorter variety, right?
Yes.
But in the forest, you get them as big as oak trees, right? They're huge.
Yeah, that's the thing. And then we're going to get to planting. But, and on, the forest, you can have these huge trees over 50 feet tall and everything. It's amazing. The biggest an apple tree gets here in America is probably usually like 35 feet tall. These guys get huge in Kazakhstan. What you're going to get here today, though, we're going to only grow about 12 feet tall because they're grafted onto dwarf, they call it dwarf rootstock, to keep them short so they're easy to pick the apples. So they'll line up here nicely. If you got the giant ones, they probably tear up your sidewalk and all that.
So